Okay, now it's time to get into some of the actual code because first, there are certain features I added, one in particular. This is not really obvious in gameplay. It's kind of hard to see directly, but it's a very useful system. At least I think it will be. And secondly, there is an interesting story about debugging that perhaps even has a little bit of a moral at the end. But what I added was this small data packet for storage, and I just call this G data, game data. And all it is, it's an integer that can be stored in a dictionary along with a ID that'll related to whatever is storing it, but it comes with these built-in implicit operators for writing things, including bool. And the idea is if you wanted certain enums, you just put those in here, even though that might work on the basis that enums are technically ints, so that probably isn't even necessary, entirely necessary even for that. The purpose of this is to store bits of data that aren't part of something really large. If you wanted to create something large complex things like new creatures, creatures are under living entities and all of that. But if you wanted to create something similar to that, you probably want to create something specialized for that. But this is a way to store little bits of arbitrary data. So, for example, if a character completes a quest in a particular way, you might store something telling that quest is completed and maybe which ending of that quest was, and then maybe some dialogues or future quests or end credit bill cards or anything like that you might want to do. You could then look at that and say, wait a minute, you completed this quest, therefore you're now eligible for another quest, or someone will recognize you that you completed the quest. So you could do that for things like quests and just general bits of data that need to persist across a game but do not necessarily fit into, there's going to be a whole bunch of this one thing. And one use for it also is to store data on things you've interacted with and changed so they don't immediately change back. If you say go through a loading screen to a different world space and come back, it won't instantly change. So say, for example, the first actual use case I have is to keep doors that you've opened from being mysteriously closed 10 seconds later. If you say go down into a dungeon, nope out, come back, and all of a sudden the doors and the building on top are all that you've opened are all closed 10 seconds later when there's no one there. But it might be a good idea if you're gone for a long time to let them go ahead and close, which is why I also have an expiring version that stores an expiration date, and it is a double. I do have my own world time system distinct from the time that comes in Unity, because time, that is just telling you seconds since the game started. This is something that goes into save files and is persistent within a save. So certain things that take more time within a save, we'll use that, and this way I have it set up so that doors that you leave open or leave out at their default state, that could be doors that you closed started out open, but doors that are left out of their default state will revert to however they started if the scene they are in is unloaded for at least 1/3 of a day. And you can see this over here. We have worldtime.day divided by timescale divided by 3. And this gets set whenever you leave a world space. It also gets, or when it's disabled, which will happen when you leave the world space, or whenever you use them, it will go ahead, and I should probably not just use on disable, but for here it works. It will go ahead and call this immediately just to be sure that it, say if you open a door and save the game and load another game and come back, that it will be the way it was when you saved the save file, even though you haven't actually unloaded it. Because that would be especially weird. You open a door, save, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do, come back, reload the game, and the door is suddenly closed. But this brings me to the part about bugs. Something really weird happened when I did this. Doors would be correct when you first entered an area. So I went in particular, I'd go into the little castle in the village that used to be on the island, and I'd go downstairs to the dungeon, which is a separate world space. The doors would be fine when I came into the castle the first time, but when I came back, they'd all be open. Weird. So I asked myself, what's wrong with this or with the way I'm saving it down here in a dictionary? And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I debugged and debugged. Turns out the reason I couldn't figure out what was wrong with this is that there was actually nothing wrong with this at all. The problem I saw was not really the problem. The problem I thought I saw was not actually the problem that was really there. It turns out the problem is the IDs. I had added a system where they would get an ID when they were serialized if they didn't already have one. If not, it would leave it alone. The problem is, as soon as I did this, everything started being assigned IDs, and at some point the prefab even got assigned IDs, and a bunch of things got their IDs from the prefab, then they all had the same ID. So even though this is working correctly, saving that a door with a certain ID should be open, because they had all been given the wrong IDs, or more to the point, the same ID, it applied to all the doors. So if I opened one of the doors in the castle, when I came back, all the doors would be open. Again, it looked like one problem, but turned out to be a completely different one. So what I did to fix this, I created this iAutoAssign that has this method. And just to be on the safe side, I do have it where this cannot run if it's in a built game. This only works if you're running in the editor. And over here with world space logic, and this handles all the chunks in the world space, all the world chunks. Currently there's only one. I did have streaming chunks like you might have streaming cells in Skyrim or chunks in Minecraft or whatever. In an earlier version, I temporarily took that out to focus on other parts of the game and to learn more about that to be sure I could do it. I was really doing it right. So for right now, it has one. Each world space has one chunk that has one. Each chunk has one scene. That won't change. The one scene per chunk, but it goes. And so each scene that is a normal scene, the scene loader that also has start screen doesn't, but everything that's like content, like the village, an island, an arena, a dungeon, anything that you think of as a place you'd go to has a world space logic attached to one component that manages that particular scene, that particular world space and the scenes within it. So, and if I had multiple chunks that might not all be loaded at once, I'd have to do something to load for these, but right now it's only one. So what you do, you have this context menu that gives you a option in the editor for the world space logic that you can select, and this will find the root of the scene, and then anything within that that has an iAuto assignable, it will call be assigned, and that way I don't have to drill through several layers of the door is under a hinge that's under a door frame that's under a wall that's under something else. It'll just go through and automatically assign something unique to each of them. So that fixed the problem. But again, not the problem I thought I was having. Later that evening, I went back and looked at it again. After finishing this, I put in the ability to have this be saved. So now this data will now be saved in the save file. Everything seemed good, but when I looked at it in the evening, I realized that doors that were open, if I loaded into a different file all the doors that were open before when I loaded the other save, and they would also be open. I thought, well, what's wrong with my save system? So again, I looked at this, and I looked a lot at the save system and tried to figure out what was wrong. Well, nothing is wrong with this again. Nothing is wrong with the save system. The problem now was over here. This is the new version. Before, it simply said unload the scene. It loaded all the save data and loaded the new scene. That wasn't a good way to do it. The problem is it would start loading the save data, but the scenes do not load and unload in a single frame. So it would load the save the save data correctly. It would load it correctly. But after loading, the scene, the old scene from the old save file that was being closed so you could load a different save, was still there, and it would end up being unloaded, and afterward, and all those on disable methods would be called as unloaded, so whatever scene was open, all the data from that scene would be added in after saving the file. So what I had to do is now I have a coroutine, and when it's unloading, it tracks it, and it will keep returning null, causing it to wait for another frame until it's done unloading, and then an extra frame just to be safe before finishing loading the data, and then starting to load the new scene, which will use that data. And that fixed the problem. But once again, and that makes 3 times in the last 2 days, the problem I was trying to debug took longer than maybe it should, because the problem I thought I had was not the problem. The problem I saw was not the real problem. It was simply a different problem disguised as what I saw. That's maybe not the best way to put it, but basically the problem I thought I saw was not the problem I actually was having. I'd say there's probably a actual general life lesson that could probably be gotten out of that as well.